drugs, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a Ph.D. in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. This episode is ad-free, and I rely on my audience to support my efforts. If you're getting value from this content, please consider becoming a paid subscriber to the Mind and Matter Substack. For just $5 a month, you'll get early access to episodes and other content, full episode transcripts, and I'll prioritize answering your questions in emails and the comments sections. You can also support me by checking out the links in the episode description to my affiliate partners who make various health and wellness products that I use and enjoy myself. You'll receive a discount and help support the podcast that way. And if you want the benefits of a paid subscription, but it's not in your budget, simply sign up for my free weekly newsletter, send me an email, and I'll give you a complimentary paid subscription. Word of mouth is the best way to help the podcast grow. So if you like what I'm doing, please share your favorite episodes with family and friends. The purpose of the podcast is to provide you with information obtained largely from primary sources, the people doing the research and producing new knowledge. This content is never meant to serve as medical advice. And with that, enjoy the episode.
It's my pleasure.
And you're a clinical psychologist, right?
Right, correct.
So what does your day-to-day look like, and what does your career look like at a high level? What's your background? Do you do mostly research? Do you see patients? Do you do both?
So I love my career because I see clients, I do consulting with corporations, I do research. I am a professor at UCLA in psychiatry and rheumatology. I train therapists at UCLA. I train the staff at UCLA. So it's good. I got my fingers in a lot of different places.
And in terms of the clinical side of this, the patients you see or that you've seen throughout your career, is it a certain type of person? Is it adults? Is it children? Is it people with certain psychopathologies? Is it otherwise normal people?
So over my career, I've worked with all kinds of people, but in more recent years, I'd say they fall into two categories. One are people who find their way to my door because they're dealing with some overwhelm around stress. They have maybe referred by their physician because they have sleep problems or other physical symptoms or emotional burnout breakdown because of that. Or the other category are people who feel stuck in their lives. It's like as hard as they work, they just can't seem to get to the next level. And so I would say those are the two basic categories of people that I see mostly. And then in my corporate work, I do work with senior executives and CEOs on how to be a more effective leader.
And do you have like a certain clinical approach or school of thought you belong to? Like I remember when I took psychology classes when I was younger, you would always learn about, the different schools of thought. There's, transpersonal psychology, there's cognitive behavioral psychology, there's, psychoanalysis and all the historical schools of thought. Is there one that you fit into, or do you think about it even in those terms?
Well, it's interesting because I started out my career in experimental psychology and physiological psychology, and I was doing brain research. So I began from a behavioral perspective, conditioning perspective, which I found to be very valuable. And then when I moved into clinical, my first training was in Gestalt therapy, which really resonated with me, and I found it very helpful. But over the years, I really have gotten training in almost every type of approach because no one approach has a monopoly on the truth. They each have a piece that I've put into the puzzle of the picture that I use now, which really incorporates from all of those different approaches. I also apprenticed with a shaman for 15 years, a shaman from South America for 15 years. And so I have that indigenous, naturalistic approach as well. They all have something to offer, the ancient, the modern, and really to be most effective, I found that when I integrate the best of all of those, that I have my greatest success.
When we think about like where our personalities and our habits come from, so whether or not it's a severe form of psychopathology like OCD, say, or something like that, or it's something more normal and mundane, like just the way that you deal with stress or some of the little habits and patterns you fall into, how do those things start to get settled into the mind when we're children? How much of it is, natural sort of innate dispositions we have? How much of it is conditioning from our parents and our environment? And how do you start to think about how habits are formed as we then think ahead to how they're broken and modified?
Well, you're touching on something that's a very important part of the work I do in terms of helping people become more resilient, because we learn how to operate in the world based on our childhood environment and the lessons of childhood. So we don't go, as we're in this very early survival adaptive learning process. And as a child, it's like survival learning, right? And so we don't go out and go to hundreds of families and sample hundreds of families to see what the real world is like to adapt to. We adapt to our own little childhood environment, believing for all intensive purposes that that's the way the world operates. So we adapt to that environment. We learn the lessons in our interactions with our primary caregivers, because as a dependent child, our survival is based on being in good stead with our primary caregivers. So we adapt to their rules, their lessons. And then that adaptation to some degree freezes to those lessons. And we use that out in the world as an adult, whether it works completely or not. And so our childhood lessons are what really sets us up in the future. And you ask how much of it is nature, how much of it is nurture. I believe it's mostly nurture, because we can have a genetic propensity to a particular illness, but it takes the stresses in our lives that actually wind up expressing those genetic vulnerabilities. Usually it needs the stress for them to be, those genetic vulnerabilities to be expressed. And so it's our environment that we adapt to that's, to a great extent, more important than our genetics.
I see. So when we're developing as small children, the home environment is effectively the entire world to us.
Right.
And so,
right.
The extent to which we are in the home environment and not exposed to other environments, we're adapting to that local environment, the types of people we're with, the types of stresses that are in that environment, all of the things that are present and lacking. That's what we're adapting to. So it sounds like, to the extent that's true, it would mean that, when we grow up and we start leaving the home environment, the extent to which there's a mismatch between the other environments we got into compared to that home environment is going to dictate how we behave and whether or not we're behaving in pathological or maladaptive ways.
Well, yes. So, for example, if you grow up in a childhood environment that's dangerous, and by dangerous, I mean, at any time, a mother or father can yell at you and you have no idea why. Or they could be critical or judgmental. You develop the sense that this is the way people in general are. So now you're an adult and you go through your day and you're always anticipating some danger, someone who's going to be judgmental or critical of you. And so you're mobilizing your stress response throughout the day, even though it may not really be necessary. And thus, you are throwing your nervous system out of balance because you're triggering that stress response too frequently. And so that's how childhood lessons then manifest out as adults, because we're anticipating people to respond to us the way our childhood environment resulted. So we can go into a room and we could be nervous because we're waiting for some danger to occur. And then we project a particular image of tension in our bodies that gets picked up by other people and may affect how they relate to us. So there's the snowballing effect of the lessons of childhood.
And how difficult is it to learn new habits as an adult? To what extent is it possible to teach an old dog new tricks? Is it very, very difficult just because those things really kind of get settled in by the time we go through childhood and puberty and become adults? Or, and I guess attached to that question would be, does that mean that we should, that it's very important to focus on sort of developing or working with someone like early in life, if you're a psychologist like you?
Mm-hmm. Well, see, here's the difficulty. On the one hand, because all of these lessons are imprinted at such an early age and they go in so deeply, it is difficult to break those childhood patterns. However, we have this tremendous capacity for neuroplasticity, for change, for adjusting, for learning new ways. And those are the two most powerful kind of processes that we have. On the one hand, the gravitational pull of those childhood patterns. On the other hand, the potential for neuroplasticity. What happens is most of us focus on how difficult it is, and that actually makes it more difficult because we are it holds us back to engage in ways of creating change. And because it is a complicated process, because you're having to deal with what's referred to as our default mode network in our brains, basically the patterns that are laid down from these childhood lessons. And so if you think about, I'm going to do something new today to set a new pattern for myself, a different pattern for myself. Well, that's great, but I have this entire history of the old pattern that this new behavior today is going up against. Mm-hmm. That carries so much more weight. That's why it's difficult, because you have to maintain new behavior, a focus and intention on creating change for quite a period of time before it starts to actually take hold in us. And people usually start and work hard at it, and then they give up, and they wind up back where they started from. And so, yes, it's difficult, but we have to focus more on that it's possible, not that it's difficult. And then we need a path. We need not only direction, but we need a methodology, a mechanism that helps us stay on the path.
And so, the environments that we grow up in shape us in many ways. They determine how anxious we are, or how we respond to stress. Some people are just much more resilient than others, and I know that's a subject of your book. Where does this resiliency come from, and to what extent is that itself something that's learned? Is it the type of thing where you don't want to be exposed, obviously, to too much stress as a child, but on the other hand, you probably don't want to be completely sheltered either. You want to be probably exposed to some moderate, intermediate amount of stress that you can somehow cope with, and is sort of practicing how to respond to stress with moderate amounts of it sort of the essence of where resilience comes from? Or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think if we were to design the optimal environment to raise healthy, resilient children, number one, always, is giving them a feeling of love and acceptance. That's the number one key. Number two is you want them to feel safe. You want them to feel like they don't have to be looking over their shoulders for danger, because that creates a defensive posture that makes it more difficult to learn. So you want them to feel safe so that they can explore, so that they can face challenges, because it's as you face the challenges of life that you learn the lessons that make you more resilient. Yes, you need to engage in the challenges and experiment in terms of your behavior, so you learn what's effective and you learn what's not effective. And so the other lesson of childhood that's so important is that it's okay to make mistakes. This is a big one, because a lot of times when I work with adults, one of the ways they get stuck is they don't want to take a step forward because they're afraid they're not going to get it right. They're afraid of the judgment of other people. And so that keeps people sort of locked in to the old patterns, because they're not giving themselves the opportunity to learn from experience and even from their mistakes.
So, I mean, it makes perfect intuitive sense that you want to create a safe and loving environment for a child, so that you are, there's this cocoon of safety, so that they are free to explore and wrestle with, the challenges that they run into as they explore the world and try new things and stuff. But there's also this concept out there of safetyism, of like helicopter parenting. So, that would be where you're keeping them too safe, probably to the extent that you're preventing them from actually exploring the environment and dealing with stresses. So how do you think about that? The line between, the good or the effective amount of safety that enables a child to explore and to make mistakes and do all of these things, versus what we might call safetyism, where, the parent is right there over their shoulder, keeping them safe to each and every little danger, such that the child never even has a chance to make mistakes.
Right. That obviously is not a good approach, because it not only doesn't give the child the opportunity to explore, make mistakes, learn that it's okay to make mistakes and learn lessons from it, but the parent is also unconsciously giving the child another message. And that's a message: I don't trust you. That's the message: I have to be this careful, because if I don't, you're going to do something wrong, make a mistake, not handle something properly. So in that approach, an unconscious message you're giving the child is you don't trust them to do things on their own, and that is stifling to the child. So yes, there is this balance between, what I like to say is, you want to put like guardrails up. So there's, within those guardrails, they have a lot of freedom to explore, experiment, and make mistakes, but they know that the parent has their back, that the parent is setting up some guidelines from which they can't go outside of. And this is the balance between protection and freedom. I can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I forgot to unmute. So there's this balance between protection and freedom. How does I think what's probably a difficult thing to figure out for many parents or potential parents is, how do they learn, where that balance between protection and freedom is? How do they know if their guardrails are too close together, too far apart? How do they learn to have a sense for this? That's probably trickier than it might sound.
Well, here's the key. The best advice I can give a parent for knowing and approaching their child in the best possible way is for the parent to go through their own therapy process. Is for the parent to do their own healing work so that they're coming from a greater place of clarity with their child, so they're not approaching their child based on lessons that they learned in their childhood. So a lot of people will either do things the way their parents did it, which is not ideal, or they'll go in the opposite direction because they're reacting to how their parents did it. And what you want is you want to work through your own wounds so that you have a clearer understanding of how to be with your child.
Mm-hmm. I have I can't remember what movie it is, but there's a movie scene I remember, and the setup is basically there's a young child. It's like a toddler, maybe a 2 or 3 year old, still sort of in a crib, still crying when it's upset, and the child is being watched by both sets of grandparents. They're both in the house at the same time, and so the child starts crying, and one of the grandfathers says, "Oh, we need to go pick up the child." Nurture the child, tell him it's okay right now, immediately. And the other grandfather says, no, we can't do that. We got to let him cry it out. And obviously, right, there's a time and place for both, but people have different thresholds for, when they go to the child and console it, to the extent that they, leave the child to sort of cry it out, so to speak, and figure out its own solution to the problem rather than relying on the nurturer. For a situation like that, how do you think about what parents should do, and how they should find that balance between going and solving the child's problems for them right away versus enabling or allowing the child to try and maybe solve their own problems for some amount of time?
Yeah. Well, there are a few considerations here. I've raised my children, and my experience is you get to learn which crying, which emotional tension is something where there's some real problem that needs my support versus some where I feel like they can work it through themselves. Mm-hmm. So I tuned in to my child to get a sense of what kind of pain or discomfort they're dealing with, or whether it may just be a frustration that if I interrupt too quickly, I'm not giving them the opportunity to learn to tolerate frustration.
So it sounds like if you're talking about a pre-verbal child who can't actually verbalize very much at all, you literally learned how to distinguish the different cries and screams and vocalizations that they made in order to distinguish whether or not they had an internal pain that needed to be addressed, that they needed help with, versus they dropped a toy that was out of reach versus something else that they could work out on their own. Like, you literally heard a difference.
Right. Now, another important aspect of this is a lot of times parents rush in because of the good intentions that the child doesn't experience any pain. Mm-hmm. And pain is part of life. Stress is part of life. Frustration is part of life. If you're going to rush in and take care of them every time they start to experience something difficult, you're not giving them the opportunity to learn to tolerate difficult circumstances. sometimes parents do that because parents themselves feel discomfort with the child's discomfort. And so the parent is actually trying to take care of their own discomfort by reaching in and doing something prematurely. So again, there needs to be the awareness on the part of the parent. What's going on here? Am I responding to a legitimate issue here, or something that really requires me to sit with my own discomfort?
Mm-hmm. And so you said that for yourself, when you raised your kids, you were tuned in. You learned how to distinguish some of the different cries. And so you that told you, because you took the time to distinguish them, you could perceive a difference. And that told you, when it was appropriate to step in right away, wait a little while, or wait a little while longer. I would imagine there's, some number of parents out there, potentially quite a bit, who never even sort of who never developed that kind of awareness themselves. And so they're reacting much more quickly and with a more like one size fits all strategy. Is that common? And how do you think about, as the adult, as the parent, developing that kind of awareness?
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. I think most people probably are not aware of these distinctions that I'm raising, and they just see crying under one umbrella. But yes, it definitely can be taught. If parents want to learn, they can. They're all capable of learning that.
And you mentioned that.
Let me just make another comment here. One of the things that I notice, which is so interesting, when I work with parents, I find that as a child goes through different stages, as their child goes through different stages, as their child has different kinds of experiences, it actually brings up emotions and memories in the parent for when they were that age going through that particular issue. Mm-hmm. And so when a parent is in therapy with me, they have the opportunity that gets triggered by what the child is going through, and it brings stuff up in the parent that's actually helpful for the parent to be addressing.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. So, as the child is developing and going through the various milestones, the parent often has images from the same period of their lives in mind. And as you said before, they probably, to the extent those are good memories, they probably try to mimic what was happening between them and their parents. And to the extent they're bad memories, they probably react in some way or overcompensate and go in the other direction.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
You said that a lot of your training early on was in something called Gestalt psychology. And I remember somewhat vaguely learning about this, in Psych 101, but what is Gestalt psychology and what is a Gestalt?
Okay. Very, very good question, and very important. So Gestalt is a German word that means whole or complete. And the origination of Gestalt therapy is through the Gestalt psychologists in Germany about a century ago. And their classic research study, they divided a group into two groups. One group, they had sit down and they gave them a 5-course dinner. And then they had them look at an abstract painting and ask, what do you see in this painting? The other group, they deprived of food for 5 hours and showed the identical abstract painting. Those who were deprived of food, every single one of them saw something food-related in the abstract painting. Those who had just eaten, not a single one of them saw anything related to food. And so it validated their concept of how we're organized and to have a need to reach completion. When I was growing up, you could still hear cigarette commercials on radio and TV. And there was this Winston jingle, and it went, Winston tastes good like a cigarette should. And in 30 seconds, they would repeat that maybe 15 times. But the last time they repeated it, they went, Winston tastes good like a... And people for the rest of the day would be walking around trying to finish that jingle in their heads and have the idea of that cigarette in their heads. And that's an important characteristic of us as humans, is that we are driven to reach completion, anything that's incomplete. And it's most relevant around emotions. So that, we learn, again, in childhood, we shouldn't, or it's not okay to be angry, or don't cry, or other lessons that result in us pushing feelings down, pushing them to the side, not noticing, not acknowledging. But all of these feelings that we don't deal with, they don't go away or dissipate on their own. They get locked in. And it results in a lot of emotionally distressed type of behavior. For example, someone can say something, and if someone is carrying a lot of unfinished emotion and it touches into their unfinished business, they may explode with anger over something very minor. We see this in couples, that couples may sit on resentments and not resolve them. And then something little in their conversation can trigger a big reaction because they're sitting on such a pool of unfinished emotional business. And so in Gestalt therapy, it's very important to begin to notice what's unfinished. The anger toward a mother or toward a father, the sadness for what we didn't, for needs that weren't met in childhood. We carry those unfinished business, unfinished emotional business with us. And then our behavior may be driven by that, but because of the unconsciousness of the connection, we engage in behaviors that will never meet that need. For example, we're trying to fill an emotional hole by earning more and more money, making more and more money, having more and more successes. And then we have the success and we realize, I'm still unhappy. I'm still sitting with that same dis-ease inside myself because we're looking for something to fill that emotional hole that has nothing to do with it. And so in Gestalt therapy, the goal is to recognize what's unfinished, what has been left incomplete, be it feelings that haven't been expressed or emotional needs that haven't been met, and heal that through a process of bringing up those feelings and those needs so that you can now engage in the world in a healthy, aware way to get those needs more appropriately met.
Mm-hmm. So going back to the original sort of description of Gestalt psychology and how it got started, you gave the example where, they would show people these abstract images, and when they were food deprived, when they were hungry, they would always read something food related into them because that was speaking to the primary need that they and their bodies needed to meet in that state.
Right.
It reminded me of, before I go there, so it sounds to me like a Gestalt. Tell me if this is a reasonable definition. A Gestalt is something like our interpretation of our conscious percepts. So it's not merely the sensory the ink blot that they looked at. It's their interpretation of it as being something due to the needs they currently have. So in the case of the hungry people, something to do with food.
Right. So it makes sense on a biological level that we are designed to get completion because it happens on all levels physiologically. Mm-hmm. If our blood pressure goes up too high, mechanisms take place to dilate blood vessels to bring the blood pressure down. So dozens of physiological processes are going on all the time based on the same mechanism. But what's important in Gestalt therapy is this emotional unmet needs. And so, yes, there's this direct relationship between what's going on inside of you and how you engage with the outside world.
It sort of sounds like, so when I was doing my PhD in neuroscience, I was doing mechanistic behavioral neuroscience. I was studying feeding behavior and circuits in the brain that controlled feeding behavior in rodents. And, there's this concept in biology that many people will be aware of, but for those who aren't, it's called homeostasis or homeostatic regulation. And it just refers to the fact that, as you mentioned, our bodies are always trying to achieve balance. If our body temperature goes up, mechanisms kick in to bring it back down, and vice versa. Same with blood pressure, blood sugar, anything you can think of. There's a narrow range in which our bodies and our cells work, and we need to keep things in that range. And so, in the case of hunger, a very intuitive example, right? If you're low, if you need nutrition and calories, your body makes you feel hungry. It generates certain feelings that you want to get rid of, and those feelings motivate you to go out and behave in the world to obtain what will quench your hunger, bring you back to homeostasis. It sort of sounds like in Gestalt therapy, you more or less think of emotions in a kind of homeostatic way, that there's natural processes by which emotions wax and wane. And if we interrupt those processes, it's almost like our emotional blood pressure gets stuck on high. And then it's going to pop out somewhere.
Exactly. And you could think as a child, if we learn that if I get angry or express my anger, I'm going to be negatively reinforced, then I learn to hold those feelings in. But holding those feelings in can be, being aware of holding those feelings in creates a conflict that we are aware of. So gradually, we interrupt the process earlier and earlier until we're interrupting it before we even have the awareness of the feeling. And that's the birth of our defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms are mechanisms designed to help us not be so uncomfortable with awarenesses of feelings and conflicts and other things going on in our childhood. But the result is that as adults, we have less and less awareness of those feelings that we're suppressing or holding in.
In terms of, when we think about what we might just call emotional homeostasis and the sort of natural rhythms by which emotions rise and then need to sort of discharge and go away. If I go back to, experiments I used to do in mice, we used to do this experiment where you can turn on neurons in their brain in a particular region of the hypothalamus that control hunger, basically. So you can turn on neurons in a mouse that's not hungry at all. It's got a full tummy, and it will behave as if it's hungry. And so you can have the mouse in the cage, you turn on these neurons, it'll start to, rear up on its legs and sniff for food, or very diligently dig through the bedding to look for food. It'll, it becomes energized. Its body is trying to compel it to find food. What's interesting is if you keep stimulating these neurons and keep generating this sense of hunger, but there's no food in the home cage, there's no food around ever to be found, eventually the mice basically start doing odd behaviors. They start behaving in ways that we might call pathological. They might start obsessively grooming themselves or doing very repetitive behaviors with objects in the home cage environment that sort of remind us of what we might call obsessive compulsive behavior in humans. And so I'm wondering how we sort of link the biological side here to the emotional side, in the sense that if some of our emotions that arise, like say we get very angry or even aggressive, if we don't have the proper outlet for that emotional behavior and we keep it bottled up, what happens? Is that a source of pathology?
Definitely. Emotions, the root of emotions is motion. And there's energy connected to our emotions. So if you're starting to experience any emotion, but then you're holding it in, you literally have to do something physical to hold it in.
Mm-hmm.
Wilhelm Reich talked about this a century ago when he talked about body armoring. And so we actually tense our muscles to hold in those feelings, and that interrupts the flow of energy in our body. It interferes with our ability to experience joy, which involves the full flow of energy in our bodies. But it ultimately interferes with optimal functioning of our bodies, which can contribute to the disease process.
And yeah, so like it, when we talk about holding things inside or bottling them up, we're speaking with colorful language, but it sounds like you would agree that there's a literal truth to that, because I think we've all had this experience where maybe you're at work and it's a professional environment. You need to be polite. You need to keep a cool head, but someone frustrates you, say, and you get really angry or even feel aggressive. You do literally tense up your muscles. Your muscles contract. You might hunch forward and things like that. So when we don't find outlets for these emotions that we inevitably naturally feel, what happens if that goes on for too long? And is there such a thing as like psychosomatic symptoms where we get literal physical manifestations of this emotional dysregulation?
Yeah, a lot of people shy away from this notion of psychosomatic, or it's all in your head, because in the past, when we would be told it's all in your head by a physician, it had a certain meaning. It had a meaning of we're somehow, imagining the symptom, that the symptom isn't really there, it's all in our head. Now we have a much clearer perspective on the relationship between mind and body, the relationship between physical, mental, and emotional, and how they're all interconnected. And so whether it's holding in feelings and having this energy that we have to clamp down on, or being stressed in any one of a number of different ways, they all contribute to an imbalance in our nervous system and what I refer to as autonomic dysregulation. And that's where the one branch of our nervous system, the sympathetic activating branch, is turned on too much of the time. And then the recovery branch, the parasympathetic, is not turned on enough. And the result is that we use up resources of our bodies, and we don't have unlimited amounts of resources. They need to be replenished. Our bodies are always making choices. Do I defend and protect, or I go into healing and growth? Do I send energy to my large muscles to prepare for fight or flight? Or do I send that energy to my kidneys so it does a better job of detoxifying my blood? So the body is always making these choices. And if you spend too much time in defend and protect, you're not giving your body enough opportunity for heal and growth.
So sometimes when we keep sort of emotions bottled up for some period of time, we know what the emotion is, we know what the cause is, and we can discharge it appropriately. Like if I'm feeling frustrated because of something that was happening professionally that week or in a relationship, you can go to the gym, go running, hit a punching bag, do something to discharge that. What about the cases where someone has unprocessed emotions? There's something that has built up inside of them that hasn't discharged, and they aren't even quite aware of what it is or that it's even a problem yet, and yet it's causing them problems in their lives. They just don't realize it. Can you give maybe an example from your clinical practice of how you get someone to identify that and work through that?
Yes, of course. And what you're describing is not uncommon. That's part of our defense mechanism. And it's part of one of the ways we defend against it is to live above the neck, to be in our thoughts, in our thinking, which makes it a little easier not to notice our feelings. And so, to some degree, being in a therapeutic environment, a therapeutic situation, is a little bit like detective work, where you have to look for the clues. And then when you find a clue, you focus in on that clue, and there may be a little bit of a feeling attached to the clue. And so you then emphasize the feeling until you open up the door to the deeper feeling. So I have I'll give you one example. I have a client who he has an elderly parent, an elderly mother.
Mm-hmm.
And the elderly parent is kind of bossy, kind of controlling. And the client, who's 50 years old, feels a little timid around his mother. He holds off really fully expressing his position, his belief, because growing up, whenever he did that, the mother had one of two different reactions. One, she would be very angry and sometimes not speak to her son for a period of time. Or as the child got into his teens and he was more verbal about stating his position, his mother would start to cry and fall apart. So between those two types of reactions, this client wanted to be a good son and not cause this kind of upset in his mother, but also not want to get on her bad side. And so he learned to not speak up. But it took work in therapy. And one of the techniques of Gestalt therapy, a lot of times in therapy, you're talking about a situation. So you're removed from the situation because essentially you're telling a story.
Mm-hmm.
So in Gestalt therapy, we bring the experience into the therapy room with us. So I would have him imagine that his mother is sitting in the room with us. And I'll actually bring over a chair. And I'd say, I'd like you as best as you can to imagine your mother sitting here. When we do that, and the client is sitting facing somebody important in their life, and it's more real, and it's in a safe environment, they begin to get in touch with the deeper feelings that they've been cut off from because they haven't allowed them. In this case, he had a lot of anger toward his mother that for the first time he was aware of. And so through encouragement, starting with just speaking that he's angry, but eventually having him literally express that anger. So we have a situation where on the one hand, we're trying to make it as real as possible. But on the other hand, because the other person isn't really in the room, the client feels safer expressing their feelings. And so that was the start of my client starting to be able to speak up, be more assertive, recognizing that it was okay to have the feelings that he had, etc. So it's a transformative process from feeling like it's not okay to have my own feelings to owning them and realizing how important it is to own your feelings.
So with this client, they weren't acknowledging even the existence of the anger that they were feeling. The anger was generated by their mother, and due to feelings of wanting to care for and not upset the mother, that anger was effectively invisible to them. What problem was that causing? Did that just cause this client to be very meek or unassertive in his general life in ways that didn't serve him?
It manifested not only with not being able to speak up and fully say his needs to his mother, but it manifested in social environments where he didn't feel like he can fully express himself, where he felt a little bit anxious being with other people because he's learned to hold himself in and not actually be who he was, be himself. And so to some extent, it gets in the way of knowing who you are and being okay with who you are, because part of what he was learning is it wasn't okay to have those feelings. And if you're not okay having your feelings, then a part of you is not okay. And so you take that not okay into other environments with you, and it could create anxiety.
And so how does this connect to like Gestalt psychology in the sense of, I know that you talked a lot about in some of the papers that you sent me, this process of Gestalt formation and destruction, and that both of these are important. You can form sort of maladaptive gestalts. You can also form adaptive ones. And so because you can have either, you have to be able to make and break them. And some people get stuck in modes that aren't serving them.
Right. So he was stuck in a mode that wasn't serving him, in that not only did he have these feelings locked in, so they were driving some of his behavior, but also he learned that it was more important to not express and not even be aware of feelings than reaching completion. So it sort of snowballed into other areas of his life where he found it difficult to reach completion, to do the last step that would complete a process. So these patterns carry on into other areas of our lives. Ultimately, the healthy approach is that when something is unfinished, when there's an unmet need or unexpressed feeling, the goal is to reach completion, so that completion allows you to move on to the next thing. Whenever we have something incomplete, a piece of us is always trying to complete that. So a piece of us is always being distracted from the present moment. And the more unfinished business, the more difficult it is for us to be fully present in the moment.
This concept of pattern completion, it makes good intuitive sense. It's really easy to think about how you deal with this when it comes to like a basic emotion or a basic instinct. So when you're hungry, when you haven't eaten for several hours, you get hungry, there's a very clear feeling you have, and you very clearly know what to do with that feeling. I need to go eat some food, or this feeling is going to continue distracting me and I won't be able to fully be present for other things I might want to engage in. When it comes to subtler or higher level emotional needs that go unmet, where it's not so obvious that there even is a need that's unmet, how does someone learn how to identify when that's the case? Like if I'm just going out through my life and I am feeling anxious or whatever because I have this unmet need that hasn't completed, how do I start to recognize in my experience what that need is and then how to complete it?
Yeah. Well, it begins with, like you just said, if someone's anxious. Experiencing anxiety is a clue in and of itself that you're sitting on unfinished emotional business. And one of the reasons why we have anxiety is because we're sitting on feelings that we don't want to be expressed. We don't want other people to notice, and we don't want to notice them ourselves. And so anytime that feelings start to bubble to the surface because something in the environment is triggering them, that bubbling to the surface will be experienced as anxiety. That bubbling to the surface will be uncomfortable, will be a danger, and the way we react to danger is with anxiety. So anxiety in and of itself is a symptom, an indication that there's some emotions that we haven't dealt with. So the first thing is to recognize the symptoms such as that, or if we overreact to something that somebody said, that's another clue that we're sitting on a pool of unfinished emotional business. So that's first step, is to be aware and notice that. The next is simply to sit with the discomfort that we notice. And sometimes I will have a client in my office put different people into the empty chair and sit with different people, and just to see if they, notice if they experience something inside of them. It could be just a twitch. It could be just a little palpitation. It could be just a little butterflies with one versus another person. And so now, oh, okay, what do you think is going on with this person? What do you want to say to this person? And sometimes the feeling or what's unfinished isn't clear to begin with, but we explore. Okay, I'd like you to say to this person, I'm angry at you for, and have them fill in the sentence. Or I'm feeling sad sitting with you because. And so it's a process of experimentation to see if something touches in a little bit more deeply to what's going on inside.
I see. So noticing those symptoms is step one, and then that needs to then be followed up by a more intentional noticing of what else could be underneath that. And oftentimes that's probably just enough in itself, is learning to pay attention to these symptoms and reacting to them by stopping and sort of paying attention to what's happening internally.
Right. So it's holding the intention. It's knowing that something is there. Now let's put a spotlight on it so that it reveals itself. And sometimes I might have a client sort of go back in their history and imagine being in their kitchen at home as a child, in another room in the house, being with certain people, and just sitting for a moment with those memories and doing it as in much detail as possible, to see if something comes up from that remembrance. So there are different approaches, different ways of getting at it, because it is in many cases like a mystery that you're trying to solve.
Mm-hmm. So can you give us a basic overview and synopsis of what your new book about resilience is about?
Sure.
Beyond the obvious.
Sure. Well, when I started in my clinical work, I immediately realized that one of the key modulators of how we experience the world, of our emotional balance, of our physical health, was stress. That a person could be doing pretty well, but as you added the stress to their lives, their coping abilities begin to fall apart. They begin to have more difficulties. And that's true in relationships as well. If we think of a wheel with the spokes on that wheel, and we identify each of the spokes on the outside of that wheel, we can identify all the different problems, symptoms, that situations that we deal with throughout our lives. But one of the things they all have in common, if you bring them down to the hub, stress is in the hub. Stress affects all of those spokes. So that's why I focused in on stress, because I found it to be so fundamental to our happiness and our health, physical and emotional. But very quickly in my work, I also realized how people have resistance to dealing with their stress. And that took me down this path of identifying all the reasons why we have resistance to dealing with our stress. Not the least of which is that, to some degree, stress is an amazing positive tool to get things done, to be focused, to be persistent, to be able to set some goals and achieve those goals. And in our lives, most of our successes have been paired with stress. And so if our successes are paired with stress and those connections are here in our brains, then there's a part of us actually being magnetized towards stress. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to shift into a model that was more about optimal functioning rather than let's manage stress, because I wanted to get away from managing something that has both positive as well as negative characteristics. And that's when I shifted into creating a model of resilience. And so my model of resilience is more than, a lot of people talk about resilience as the ability to bounce back. And so it's about, after a stress, you recover baseline. After a stress, you come back to where you started from. And to me, that was too limiting, because I wanted to address everything that not only contributed to us bouncing back, but I wanted to address everything that may result in us engaging in more stresses than we need to be. I wanted to address everything that contributes to us moving through our day, in which we jump from one stress to another, to another, to another, without giving ourselves the opportunity for recovery. And so that's when I identified these 9 pillars of resilience. And so my model is a very comprehensive model of optimal functioning. And to me, resilience and optimal functioning are really the same. And so I've gotten away from this notion of resilience as the ability to bounce back, and I refer to it as the ability to bounce forward. And that's because one of the keys to the process is every time you engage in a challenge in your life, every time you engage in a stressful experience, at the end of that experience, you don't want to get back to where you were at the beginning. You want to be further ahead. You want to learn the lessons of that challenge, of that stress, of that experience, so that you grow your capacity and your capabilities, so that when you encounter the next stress, it doesn't seem quite as stressful because you're more capable of handling it. So my 5th pillar of resilience, which is mental balance and mastery, includes our mindset. And that's a growth mindset. It's a positive mindset. It's a one in which you want to embrace the challenges that you face in life rather than either shrink from them or handle them from this place of cowering. Oh, do I have to do this? Like, do I really need to do this? Maybe I can step aside and not deal with this. Instead, you want to say, I want to handle this challenge because that's what's going to stimulate my own growth and development. And that's the mindset of a resilient person.
What's the difference between bouncing forward and growth versus merely being busy and preoccupied all the time?
Well, a lot of us are busy and preoccupied as a way of not noticing, as a way of being unconscious. as a way of being on automatic rather than in the present moment, engaged with the desire to grow and learn from experience. So most of the time, or much of the time, people are just trying to get by. So again, they wake up in the morning worrying about what can go wrong, as opposed to thinking about what can go right. And so we get busy because when we're occupied, again, we don't notice unfinished emotional business. But the result is that we're just running in place. The result is number one, we're not making any real growth or progress in our lives. And number two, we are building up the stress in our lives that we experience.
Can you talk a little bit about your general orientation between helping people cope with stress and become resilient and become emotionally just stronger and better, and pharmaceutical medications? Do you think that there's a place for those? Do you think we over-rely on medications? Do people sort of use the ease with which medications are available today as another way of being unconscious, as not stopping and noticing? Because it seems today like a lot of people's first instinct, if anything is wrong in their lives emotionally or whatever, is to try and get a prescription for something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So first off, medications in certain circumstances can be both life-saving and make a person's life easier to live. So I want to begin with to acknowledge that. Having said that, number one, we use them much, much too much. We use them exactly for the reason you just said, is that people want a quick fix. And real resilience comes only from an ongoing process of growth in which you challenge the old beliefs and the old patterns which don't serve you, but have been conditioned in you. And so they are ingrained. And so anything that we want to address and transform and change, those old patterns have been going on for years. So of course it's going to take time to learn healthier behavior and patterns. And people are, to a great extent, resistant to that, or just give up too easily. We have a medical profession that contributes as well. We have a medical profession that's quick to give the sleeping pill, quick to give the blood pressure medication, quick to give all of the drugs that address the symptom, but not the underlying mechanism that resulted in the symptom. But they have the attitude that the medication is just as good as if the person went through the process of healing themselves. The attitude that most people have is, in fact, I had this just the other day. I had somebody who was clearly out of shape, ignoring a lot of his feelings, but he had blood pressure medication that was keeping his blood pressure in a normal range. And he was perfectly content. He says, hey, my doctor says I'm doing great. I got this blood pressure medication, and the mechanism that initially caused the high blood pressure is still going on. The imbalance in his stress response to recovery response is still happening. And so the medication is like masking the process. So do we use too much medication? Yes, we use medication too quickly in a process without showing the patient that there's an alternative approach, that's a lifestyle approach, that's a resilience approach, that's a better eating approach, etc. those need to all be tried before you reach for the medication.
Do you find that a lot of people, a lot of clients that you've seen have either forms of psychopathology, forms of emotional dysregulation that are downstream of things like their diet?
Yes, definitely, and particularly in children.
Mm.
Um,
what are some of the major themes there for you?
Well, ease becomes more important than the right foods. And so going to McDonald's is easier than making a good, healthy meal at home. And I understand, in families, both parents may be both working, and it makes it more difficult, but it doesn't take away from the fact that fast foods are going to create problems, and I think are a big contributor to how much behavioral problems we have in schools, how much attention issues we have in children. For these reasons, as well as related, not getting enough sleep and things like that. So, yeah, I think diet plays an important role in all of what we're talking about.
And you mentioned too that you've also apprenticed with a shaman in South America. Can you talk a little bit about that? What prompted that, and what was that apprenticeship all about exactly?
What we see and what we're tuned into in terms of what's visible, both visually, auditorily, is only a fraction of all the signals that are out here in front, in and of, and around us. Our TV picks up certain signals that we can't pick up. We need the TV to translate them into a form we can see. Well, when we talk about shamans, when we talk about indigenous approaches to life, to the universe, they have different ways of tuning in to areas of the spectrum that we normally aren't tuned into. And it opened, so I did it because I wanted to open, we can use Aldous Huxley's term, I wanted to open my doors of perception. I wanted to expand them. I wanted to see what right now I can't see. And back to what we've been talking about of emotional holding patterns, I felt in my own life that I had some blocks in those areas, that I was really, really good in having defense mechanisms that blocked me from some of my emotions. And because I was successful in my life, I was not encountering the crisis that may break me open to those deeper feelings. So it was through the work with the shaman that process actually occurred, where I really felt broken open past my defenses to my deeper feelings. And it took me to a whole other level of growth and development. It took me to a whole other level of having courage to face these deeper levels. So there were a few times where I went through the dying process, which was a powerful transformative process for me. And it took that work with the shaman for these things to occur. So they were tremendously growth enhancing for me. It gave me a whole different perspective and view of the world as well, beyond the sort of, I would say, the narrow one that I grew up learning, or that we learn in Western society.
So you felt like you experienced your own death?
There were a few times where I faced my death, where I felt like to step forward was to die, and without knowing what that was going to be like, and even not knowing if I would really die. And it was going through those doorways, so to speak, and coming out on the other side and discovering I was okay was some of the biggest learning experiences for me, because it showed me that I can take these steps forward and I will be okay. So it affected my sense of confidence in myself as well as the world around me, and get to a deeper place of acceptance of what goes on in our world, in our lives.
Mm-hmm. And what was the context and the setting for these experiences? Was this an ayahuasca ceremony in the Amazon? Was it something else?
It was with various plant medicines, teacher tools. Yes. Yeah.
And what is that something that you came to later in life, or that you had previous experience with?
So, I experimented earlier on, but these experiences actually began when I was about 40 years old.
Mm-hmm. And, in things like traditional ayahuasca ceremonies, obviously there is a pharmacological component to those, but they're often done in ritual settings. There's there's a very clear structure there, and in many indigenous cultures that have these practices, it's not merely a tool for someone who thinks they're sick and needs to get better. It's often just a recurring, regular thing that people do with some cadence. So every month or every few months or whatever, people engage in this structured ritual, whether or not they're feeling down or they're feeling normal or they're feeling good. And there's there seems to be something about that ritual and that routine and that almost normalcy to it. Do you think that's the case? Do you think there is something those approaches offer above and beyond the drug or the pharmacological component that has to do with the ritual setting in which they take place?
Yeah, that was the approach that I experienced and I was involved in. And it's about, I'll say in general, when I was director of a clinic, we had a saying that access to a human soul is a sacred honor. And it was an attitude and approach that I have and continue to have in working with clients, is that deep, deep respect and honoring of the trust that the other person holds in me. And in the journey work, it also is very important to approach it from a place of deep respect, that it works within a model of oneness of everything in the universe. And you're tapping into something that is universal in nature. And it's both honoring and respecting these teacher tools, plant medicine, as something that we want to respect and honor the process and do it with tremendous humility, as opposed to doing it just to have a good, fun evening. It's not for that purpose. It's for deep learning and deep healing.
Your book about resilience, is this primarily a book that's aimed at people who want to build more resilience, or is it for a very general audience?
It's for a very general audience. It's for people who are right now suffering from physical symptoms, emotional, mental symptoms, because it's about, as I said, optimal functioning. It's identifying these 9 pillars that cover every aspect of how we engage with ourselves and the world, and helping people improve along each of these 9 dimensions. And I do it within the context of a methodology that I refer to as the path, because I found that people can be very overwhelmed when they think of stress management, when they think of becoming more resilient, when they think of any kind of change. It can feel overwhelming. And so the way I lay it out in my book is to identify what it takes to be on the path. And so the path is right here today. It's not some future goal all the ways down that I have to work hard and hard for a long time to get to. Every day, it's possible to take steps onto the path by following some of the steps in each of the 9 pillars. And so within each chapter of the 9 pillars, there are steps you can take that put you onto the path. And once you're on the path, you can go, today I'm doing something that put me on the path, rather than worrying about what you still need to be done. So it's a very reassuring mindset that helps people stay with it. And then if they fall off the path, there's some simple steps they could take to get back onto the path. So it's for everybody, but it's also about optimal functioning. So no matter what level you are on these 9 pillars, there's always more for you to attain, for you to develop, to get better and better, becoming more and more resilient.
What's the difference between good stress and bad stress? Stress that, overwhelms people and leads to issues versus stress that's motivating and invigorating and gets people to keep moving forward and growing. Is it just have to do with the frequency and the intensity of the stress, or are there just completely different types of stress?
Well, yes to both of those questions, okay? So on the one hand, there are different kinds of stresses. There are stresses that are more positive in nature, getting a promotion, getting married, getting into a new relationship, stepping into a gathering that can be a little challenging. So there are a lot of having a baby. There are a lot of stresses that are positive. And Hans Selye, the founder who did thousands of studies on stress and is the one who coined the term, took the term stress from physics into behavior. He referred to that as eustress, EU stress, and as opposed to distress. So yes, there are different kinds of stresses we encounter that could be eustress or distress, but whether it's one or the other, when you pile too much stress onto a person's life, even the good stress can be overwhelming. Even the good stress can cause problems if what it's sitting on is already a lot, like too much for a person to handle. So quantity is important as well as quality. And of course, a piece of all of this is how we approach stress. If we approach stress as a challenge, as an opportunity to grow, it's going to be less impactful than if we approach it with, oh my goodness, look what I have to deal with. So attitude always is a factor in the impact of stress in our lives.
Do you find in your clinical practice that do you think that anyone can sort of learn to, some people are very good at dealing with stress. They almost enjoy it or they relish it. They see it as a growth opportunity. They see it as a fun challenge to overcome. And other people are just completely overwhelmed by even like the littlest stress in their life. Can the second person become the first person, and how common is that? Do you think that's possible for anyone, or do certain people have to do much, much more work than other people?
So there's an interaction between a person's innate temperament and what we're talking about. So there are people who are more quiet, who feel more comfortable being either by themselves or just with a few people, than people, we refer to them as introverts and extroverts. But that gets confused with what we've learned. It gets confused with some of the things I've already been talking about. So whether you're an introvert or extrovert, you can learn these lessons in order to handle stress in a much more effective way so that they have less of a negative impact on you. And so an introvert might find that once they develop some of these techniques, that they feel more comfortable going out into the world. They still may be introvert in that they'll go out into the world and they'll enjoy themselves, but they may need to come back into their home more quickly than somebody else because that's their nature. But the difference is that they will feel more comfortable out in the world learning these techniques.
Is there something in your book that you think will surprise people or that they might find counterintuitive about the nature of stress and resilience?
Well, again, the first thing was my notion of bouncing forward rather than bouncing back. I think, and I introduced that early on in my book, and I think that surprises a lot of people who always have thought about it as bouncing back. The other is where I tell people it's important to be accepting of yourself, because a lot of why you're having struggles with stress are not your fault. They're inherent in some of the structural aspects of growing up and evolution that we've talked about already. And so that's another very important awakening for a lot of people, is to not blame themselves for having some of the problems, the stress-related problems that they have. And I would say the other important thing is that people realize that the voice they're listening to 24/7, their internal parent, so to speak, is always wrong. And most people have difficulty with that. But it's that I say that parent that comes from a place of judgment, criticism, maybe being too hard on you, that's never okay. It never serves you. People think, well, if I make a mistake, I have to be hard on myself because that's going to motivate me more. And I point out in my book that no, that's not the case. When you're hard on yourself, what the message you're giving yourself is that you're not okay. And if you feel not okay, you're going to feel less confident the next time you have to engage in this kind of behavior. And so I say, and continuing on that note, I say that even when your internal voice tells you a fact, it's still wrong. And people go, wow, what do you mean? When they're telling me a fact, how can it be wrong? And I give the analogy. If you come home as a child with a 90 on your report card, and your mother or father say, why did you get those 10 wrong? Well, that's a fact. You did get 10 wrong, but they're emphasizing the wrong thing. And that's why it's wrong. And so that's what the internal voice typically does. It emphasizes the negative and dismisses the positive. And I find that people have great difficulty in their lives taking in compliments, taking in their goodness, because they're so focused on what they're doing wrong, what they might do wrong. So those are some of the kind of the points in my book that I think would be surprising to people.
What do you think? That sort of might be related to this question, which is in general with ourselves and how we treat ourselves, but also in the context of, say, parents and children. What is your general take on the right balance between positive and negative reinforcement, encouraging good things that we want to see more of versus punishing bad things that we don't want to see more of?
Mm-hmm. So this is how my first pillar of resilience is our relationship with ourselves. And everything else emanates from that. So I already said that most of us have this internal parent that could be critical, judgmental, negative, comparing us to others, all kinds of approaches that we can say are negative. And I'm telling the people that I work with and tell people in my book that that's always wrong. And then I contrast it with what I define as a healthy internal parent or a healthy internal voice that comes from a place of love, compassion, acceptance, support, self-care, and joy. And so when you ask how much it should be positive reinforcement, how much negative, I try to avoid all negative. I think rather than saying you shouldn't have done that, you want to say, this is the way to do it. Instead of a person in their own life saying, when they're faced with a challenge, instead of saying, wow, this is difficult, which then sends them down the negative direction, you want to say, let me think about how I can do it. Let me take this challenge. So again, this is the positive mindset. So a positive approach is always better than any negative approach.
Do you feel like people deal with stress differently today than they did 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago? Are we becoming more easily stressed? Do we have more distractions today? Or do people sort of react, when you think about the beginning, the middle, the end of your career, or even earlier in your life, has the general relationship of Americans to stress changed, in your opinion?
Well, life has gotten more and more complex, more and more complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you think about the weight of all of that complexity and all the stresses, there is more now than ever before when we look at it. People may have more stuff, but the more stuff usually does translate into anything that helps us with stress. It can if we look at what we have and we translate that into, hey, I'm safe. I have more money in the bank, or I'm safe for this reason or that can contribute to our resilience. But most of the time, we're not focusing on that. And quite frankly, even though life has gotten supposedly better, most people are still struggling with stress more than ever before because of the complexity, because, our lives change based on the world around us. And so if there's more material things in the world, we simply feel we have to have more material things that cost more money, that cause us to work harder to get them. And so it gets back to what our mindset is. If we can focus in on the positives in our lives, that can help us feel less stressed. Many years ago, I traveled through Europe and in Africa in a little camper van with my wife. And our world was in this little van, no TVs, no radios, or anything like that. But we were very happy and not stressed at all because we were not confronted with, what people are telling you to buy, to purchase, what you should be concerned about, afraid of. And so that little world that we were living in had no stress whatsoever, very little stress. The stress was where we're going to find something to eat. So there's a lot more stress in the world, but a lot of it is created by the environment, the more complexity in the environments that we live.
And is the book out now? And where can people find it?
So the book will be available on June 4th.
June 4th.
But you can order a pre-publication copy. I gave you a link for a special offer that gives a free 6-week audio program on resilience when you purchase my book before launch date. I don't know when this interview will be shown, but I'm also doing a 10-day resilience challenge from May 15th to the 25th. It's free. And each day I go into a different pillar of my model of resilience to help people determine how resilient they are as their starting point. So people can order my book now.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll put that information. The episode will go up today, May the 3rd. And I will put that information, that link up in the episode description for people who want to check it out. Is there anything else you want to mention about the book or anything you want to reiterate that we talked about today?
I think, I appreciate your questions. They've been all very good questions, and we've covered a lot of territory. I just want to emphasize that this book, the goal is not just to present information. My goal, if I'm going to write a book, is that people actually make changes based on the book, that people actually find the book stimulating and easy enough to follow that they actually will read the entire book and take the steps delineated in the book. So I've anticipated people's resistance. I've anticipated places people get stuck, and I preemptively address them so that people stay committed to the process, stay motivated, and stay hopeful. So I would say that would be the one other thing I wanted to mention, that I've really thought about how people read the book and how people might use it to make sure that people benefit the most from it.
All right. Well, I think that's a great place to end it. Thank you again for your time. This was fascinating, and we scheduled this on short notice, so I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for the interview. I've enjoyed it very much.